and peace be unto my Christian friends for the Lord and Savior Jesus. Amen. We continue our series on facing your giants, and today we look at desperate days. We've all had them. How do you deal with them? Well, brief introduction. A desperate man sits in the corner of the church, dry-mouthed, moist palms, hardly moving. He feels out of place in a room full of disciples, almost shamed. He just violated every belief he cherishes. He can't believe he did what he did. He hurt every person he ever loved, and especially one very special to him. And now, on Sunday, he sits and he stares, unable to speak. If these people knew what I did, he thought to himself, they would surely throw him out of the room. He could be an addict, a thief, a child beater, a wife cheater, or any other worse crimes he wouldn't want to mention. He even could be a sheep, single, pregnant, confused, not knowing where to turn or what to do. He could be any number of people for any number of reasons. It comes to God's house in his condition, helpless, hopeless, and desperate. How will the congregation react? What might he find? Criticism or compassion? Rejection or acceptance? Raised eyebrows or extended hands of welcome? Well, David, our hero, is desperate. David is on the lam, the text tells us. A wanted man in Saul's court. Today we would say David's face decorates the wall of every post office. He is a wanted man, so to speak. He runs, looking over his shoulder, sleeping with one eye open, and eats while holding his sword in a moment's notice. What a blur of series of events that have swirled around David's life. It was only 2 or 3 years ago that he was tending sheep in Bethlehem for his father. Then Samuel came and covered David with oil, and so did God's Spirit as Samuel anointed him. David went from serenading sheep to serenading King Saul because he was vexed with an evil spirit. This overlooked runt of Jesse's litter became the talk of the town. Enemies feared him. Michal, Saul's daughter, married him. Saul hated him. After 6 attempts on his life, David gets the message. Saul don't like me too much, do you think? Right? Yeah. With a price on his head and a posse on his tail, he kisses Michal and his life in the king's court goodbye, and he runs for his life. Well, where could he go? To Bethlehem? And perhaps jeopardize his family? He would never do that. Into enemy territory and risk his own life? Why? Go from the frying pan into the fire? Not likely. For now, he chooses another hideout. Believe it or not, the church. In 1 Samuel 1, which we just read. Now David went to Nob, to Elimelech, the priest at the tabernacle. David, desperate for his life, runs to church. David rushes to a small town seeking sanctuary from his enemies. Desperate is David, terribly so. But first, David is desperate for food. David's arrival brings Elimelech rather scared, trembling to him, not knowing if he's coming in peace or not. What brings a warrior to little Nob is Elimelech's thought, to be sure. What does the son-in-law, the king, want? David lies to the priest. Did you hear it? Saying he's on the king's secret business, but desperately needs food. We saw last week how David, even a man declared to be after the heart of God, so many times falls flat on his face. He does it again here. Desperate David resorts to lying. Did you hear that? This man after the heart of God is a liar added to the list. Does that surprise you? Well, up to now, David is stellar and spotless. Snow White, we would say. Now he lies, almost blatantly and convincingly. I'm on this mission. He's not on some secret mission. He's a fugitive running for his life. Unfairly so? Yes, of course. There was no reason that Saul wanted to kill him. But fugitive nonetheless. So he lies about it. And he does so very easily. It almost rolls off his mouth without even thinking. The priest has some bread. But unfortunately, it's not common bread. It's rather the holy bread on the altar. See, each week 12 loaves were placed on the table before God as an offering on the altar of showbread. Okay? After the week, only the priest could eat this bread. I mean, talk about day old. This was already a week old. But David was no priest. And so the bread had just been placed before the altar of God. What was Elimelech to do? Distribute the bread and violate the laws of the tabernacle? Or was he to keep the bread and ignore David's hunger? Kind of stuck in between. Elimelech looks for a loophole. And he says, well, there is no common bread here, only the bread before the Lord, the holy bread. But if your men have kept themselves from women, you know what Elimelech is asking David? Essentially, Elimelech wants to know if David and his men have behaved. You've been messing around as you war across the countryside? Or have you been righteous and pure? Blame it on the fresh baked bread, perhaps. But David responds with lie number 2. My men have not so much as laid eyes on a woman. Really? I mean, David's band of men, according to 1 Samuel 2:22, says this: these men were those in distress, or in debt, or discontent. About 400 men were with David. These were not your upstanding citizens that were faithful and true to their spouses back home. These were the ruffians, the shenanigans, the people that were constantly in trouble and looking for another way to get into more trouble, so they joined David. These men looked rough. So Elimelech had to swallow pretty hard to accept David's lie, didn't he? Right. Elimelech gave David and his men the bread. Next, David is desperate for a soldier. Now, I ask you a crazy question. You think David's faith is wavering a little bit here? I mean, not so long ago, it was the shepherd's sling was all he needed as he marched out to face Goliath, which you saw last week. Now, the one who refused the armor of Saul requests a weapon from the priest. Does that make sense to you? So what has happened to our hero? David lost his God focus, as we learned last week. Now his enemies were on the big screen of David's mind. It's all he could see. Saul's men hunting him down, executing him, or whatever. David, you see, is desperate. What about our desperate days? You ever notice how our focus changes with different circumstances and other struggles that come to your life and mine? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if my cancer spreads? What if this? What if? Ever play those games? Before Goliath, David's focus was on God, and he was extremely confident from that. Now, running for his life, David's focus slips a little, and he is desperate. See, circumstances oftentimes don't cause desperation. It's how we view those circumstances that cause it. When David faced Goliath, all he was confident was that God would fight for him, and that's exactly what happened. Now, running for his life, David is trying to rely on himself. That's a reason to be desperate, is it not? Circumstances in our lives change as well. Teenage and pregnant, middle-aged and unemployed, old-aged and sickly. Every cycle of life has its circumstances that will cause us to question whether we rely on God or ourselves. Once our focus shifts from God, there is reason to be desperate. So where can we go when we are desperate? Well, where did David go? David went to the house of the Lord, right? We can too, provided it doesn't snow half a bucket. David talked with the priest Elimelech. Yes, he lied to him, yes, but he was in the right place, right? We too can talk to a pastor or minister. During those things, put God's focus back where it should be. It helps us deal with our desperate days. So often, the focus helps us recognize where we are. Look at what you're looking at. Did you hear that? Look at what you're looking at. Where's your focus? So back to David. Ironically, the only weapon of the sanctuary was the sword of Goliath. I say ironically because that really spoke a message. David is without weapons, right? And the only one they find is Goliath's old sword that David used to kill the Goliath. It was a good reminder to David. David was to be God-focused. Eugene Peterson sees this interchange as the function of the church. He writes, in the church, I, like David, get bread and a sword, strength for the day and weapons to fight. And that's exactly what our praise worship service is all about. We get bread at the Lord's Supper, to be sure. Bread that nourishes our souls, helps us look at God-focused life. And strength for the day, weapons to fight. We have the Word of God, which God says is a two-edged sword, able to defeat all enemies. You see, the church exists to provide both food and equipment for the desperate. Neither, never, and either or. It is always a both and. Does the church succeed in doing so? Not always, no. Helping people is never a tidy trade, because desperate people usually don't have tidy lives, do they? People come to the church as refugees, seeking shelter from their angry souls in some cases, and their own bad decisions in many others, much like David. The Elimelechs of the church, like the church leaders and pastor, are often forced to choose not between right and wrong, but degrees of both. Do I help this person? Do I fill his need? Do I deal with the issue? How are we to handle desperate people? Is always the question, isn't it? So what would Jesus do? I think Jesus calls the church to lean in the direction of compassion, and not merely toward the law or keeping the letter of the law. Remember in Matthew chapter 12? Jesus' disciples are out in the grain fields on the Sabbath. Okay? His disciples are hungry and begin to pick grain and eat them. Notice what they did. They grab a head of grain. They do this between their hands as they shuck out the chaff and the hull, blow it all away, and then pop the kernels in their mouth. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." They considered that merely rubbing out the grain and kernels in one's hand harvesting, which was a no-no on the Sabbath. He answered, notice what he says, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry?" We just got done reading. He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which only was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Jesus points out that sometimes the law gets set aside in order to help one's need and to fill one's belly, to help desperate people find some hope. So, at the end of our church day, the question is not how many laws were broken, but rather how many desperate Davids were nourished and equipped. That's your job and mine. The Elimelech teaches us that the church needs to pursue the spirit of the law, not merely its letter. Okay? David teaches us that desperate people seek help from amongst God's people. That's why it is so important that we get to know each other, to feel each other's pain, to carry each other's burden, to support in prayer and encouragement each other's struggles. That's the job of the church. David stumbles in our story, to be sure. Desperate people always do. That's part of desperation. But David stumbles into the right place, where God meets and ministers to hopeless people. So often people tell me, I've been involved with God in the church for so many years, I'm sure when I walk in, the building's going to collapse. Have you ever heard that saying? Oh, the church, the ceiling, the roof will cave in, right? I've never seen that ever happen in my 36 years in ministry. And I've seen a lot of desperate people walk into the church feeling so out of sorts with God that they thought for sure God is going to bring down this big giant thumb and squish them in the back pew. But it doesn't happen. Instead, God encourages them, supports them, forgives them, loves them, and says, I am walking with you now. Remember my introductory story of that desperate man sitting in church? Did I tell you the size of the congregation? No. It was very small. Very small. A dozen or so. People clustered together for strength. Did I tell you the location of that particular gathering? No, I didn't do that either. It was a borrowed upstairs room in Jerusalem. It was on that Sunday, after Friday's crucifixion. Yes, that Sunday, after his Thursday night betrayal. Okay, I didn't put any movement on that. And that desperate man cowering in the corner, do you know who he was? Of course you do by now. He was Simon Peter. While he covered his ears, he could not stop the sound of those empty promises that circled in his mind. I'd die for you before I betray you. Oh yeah, Peter. Peter, along with the others, wondered what place God has for them now. And then into this room, filled with desperation, guess who enters? The resurrected Jesus. Jesus brings bread for their souls when he said, peace be with you. He also brings a sword for their strength when he says, receive the Holy Spirit. Bread and a sword. Jesus brings both to his desperate disciples today. Jesus still does that for you and me. So, any questions? Yes, Mark?
What turned the king against David? Didn't he just win the war for him? Like defeating Goliath?
First of all, we know that Saul was very jealous. So when they came back after defeating Goliath and the Philistine army that you saw last week, okay, the people all shouted Saul's praise. He slayed his 1,000, praise be God. But they turned to David and said, but David slaughtered 10,000s. Praise be to God. Saul already then, we are told, was jealous of David. As because God's Spirit had left him, the evil spirit, you're only inhabited by one spirit or the other. So God's Spirit left, an evil spirit inhabited Saul. And he was vexed by that. So how much of this was prompted by Satan himself to get at David? I don't know. I mean, he certainly could feed into Saul's jealousy. I mean, on one occasion, David is sitting at the big dining room table of Saul, and Saul picks up a javelin and throws it at him across the table. David ducks and the thing goes to the wall behind him. Okay. On another occasion, David is missing from Saul's table. And Saul asked Jonathan, where is he? Okay? And Jonathan and David had already talked around about that. He's going to be gone, and warned Jonathan that if your father is upset with me, just tell him I had to go home to Bethlehem to do a sacrifice for my family. Okay? Well, Saul turned on his own son and threw a javelin at him. for protecting David. Of course, Jonathan jumps out of the way and the javelin goes in the wall. Okay? Saul reminds Jonathan that as long as David lives, he will not succeed him in the throne. But Jonathan is not interested in the throne. He goes out to meet with David. And they have it already set up that when he shoots his arrows in practice in archery and so on, if he tells his runner to go get the arrows, and he says they're way beyond the stone, or they're before the stone, was the word set up between Jonathan and David to let David know whether he should leave and run for his life or come back home. Jonathan said, the arrows are way beyond that big stone. In other words, David, get out of here. My father is after you now. Jonathan and David then embrace and cry because they know they'll never see each other again. The next text we have is this one right here. David is on the land, running from Saul.
With 400 guys.
Yeah. Real incognito, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, how do you hide 400 people for crying out loud? I have no idea. Okay?
How do you feed 400 people with 12 loaves of bread?
Well, that's precisely right. That certainly didn't go around feeding masses, for sure. Okay? But it was better than nothing. Short of nothing, but better than. Okay? Yeah. Okay? Anything else?
Whatever happened to David's first wife?
Michael? She ends up never having children, and Saul gives her to another man. So essentially, he divorced Michael and David, and gives Michael to somebody else. Okay? Go ahead.
How do you perceive Peter was accepted by the 12 people in the room upstairs, as you call it?
How will the other disciples accept this betrayer? Probably better than Judas, of course, who sold Jesus into the high priest and so on. But if they were honest about themselves and recognized their own sinfulness, they probably accepted Peter just like Jesus did. You see?
Because they were friends as well, no?
Yeah, they were friends, exactly.
So that it was like consoling a friend. What if it was just somebody they didn't know that did this?
Right? And even the Jesus' appearances after the resurrection didn't assure Peter of that as well. You go to John chapter 21. Okay? Peter decides to go back to fishing. Why? He figured he couldn't be a disciple of Jesus anymore after what he did. Okay? So they spend the whole night fishing and catches little or nothing. Right? The next morning there's a fire, charcoal fire, and some fish roasting on the fire. And Jesus is there. And he says to Simon Peter, Simon, do you love me? Peter says yes. Jesus asks him again, do you love me? Peter says yes. He asks him a third time. Why 3? Huh? 3 times Peter denied him, right? Yeah. Do you love me? The other interesting thing is there are 4 different words in Greek for love. Okay? The 2 that come into play here are eros and agape. Okay? To love something with eros means I love you for what you can give me. That's why it's often used in a sexual relationship. Okay? My satisfaction. I love you for how you satisfy me. Okay? But it's also very personal or selfish love. Okay? It has everything to do with my satisfaction and my benefit. And if that satisfaction and benefit is not being received, then the love is over. Okay? So Jesus asked Peter, agape, do you agape me? That's the second word. Do you love me no matter what? Are you willing to sacrifice yourself for me and love me that much? Peter responds, "Oh yes, Lord, I'll eros you. I'll love you for all I can get out of you, and then when this gets too hot, I'll drop you like a hot potato." Jesus says, "No, that's not what I asked you. Will you agape me?" Peter said, "Oh yeah, of course. I'm going to love you for all I get out of you, and then drop you like a hot potato." "No, Peter, you already did that." So Jesus switches the words. He says, "Okay, Peter, do you really eros me?" Now the text tells us Peter becomes sad, evidently catching the message. And he goes, "Yeah, I guess I am. You really love me just like that? You know, Lord, I really want to agape you." That's the interplay in John chapter 21. There beside the Sea of Galilee. You see? Peter hadn't caught it yet, had he? Any other questions? Wasn't intending to do all that, but that's what comes up. Yeah. Question?
How would the other disciples have known that Peter did that?
Probably some didn't, because, but they. But it was at the supper meal where Jesus says to Peter, "You're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows twice." And Peter makes this grand promise, "I'd rather die for you than betray you," in front of everybody. Now, how loud did he say it? Were other people talking and missed it? Perhaps. Okay? But it happened in the upper room, at the table, with the Lord's Supper, right? You see? And most of them saw his grand, gallant effort to defend Jesus by swinging his sword and lops off the servant's ear. I mean, you really want Peter to defend you? He's that great a marksman, he misses the guy and cuts off his ear? I mean, man, put that sword away before you really hurt somebody, Peter. Like yourself, shoot yourself in the foot type thing. That's what we see in Peter. You see? And then when Jesus gives himself up to his arresting party, the disciples all run. Okay? Now, John and him are the only 2 that are allowed in the inner courtroom of the high priest. Okay? So, and that's where the betrayal happened. So, did the other disciples know about the betrayal? Well, we know John did, because he was there. Did the other disciples hear about it from John? Perhaps. We don't know. We don't know. Okay? Any questions? Please.
Well, just a comment. I mean, sometimes it doesn't matter if somebody actually knows, you know.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So you can be your biggest.
Sure. The shame and the guilt that Peter is holding. I mean, the text tells us after he denied him the 3rd time. Okay. Jesus looked across the courtroom at Peter, and then it dawned on him what he did. Because the rooster is crowing very loudly at this point. What does the text say? He went out and wept bitterly. Oh yeah. Those were bitter tears. Very bitter. Okay? All right, just a kind of review of sorts. On April 27th, I'll be teaching on the life of David. We put the whole picture together in one big shot on an evening, and hopefully it's not snowing in April. But anyway, we go on with our service and our offering, and please note any prayer requests. I'll be down to pick those up.